Welcome, this is Najma with Global Village Space. I have with me today the Honourable Minister for Planning and Development and former Finance Minister, Mr. Asad Umar. Asad Sahab, thank you for joining me today and giving me the time.
Most welcome.
Asad Sahab, I'd like to start off by asking you about the Planning Ministry itself and asking what role does it play in the overall scheme of things, given that Pakistan is a federation?
Okay, so the original role of the Planning Commission was a very broad role, and back in the 60s, Planning Commission led the economic strategy development for Pakistan and really controlled how the economy of Pakistan was going to grow. Over the last few decades, that role has evolved, particularly in the last 30 years since Pakistan has gone into repeated IMF programs. That role has become fairly circumscribed. So what are the key things that the Planning Commission is responsible for these days? Really two particular things that it is most responsible for. One is the development of the annual public sector development program. That's the federal government spending on development programs. So it is responsible for putting that together. It also houses and is the main instrument for the approval process for all projects above a certain size, including the provincial projects. So the provincial projects, wherever foreign funding is required, will also come to the CDWP, which is chaired by the Deputy Chairman Planning Commission. So that's one very, very significant part of the role. Then for the last few years, CPEC is a part of the responsibilities of the Planning Commission, and CPEC Authority is also a part of the Planning Commission.
CPEC, but what kind of projects are you working on within the planning division other than CPEC related projects?
So if you look at the shift of the emphasis, what has happened is that in the previous 5 years, there was a lot of investment that went in the public sector development program on highways, motorways, etc. We are still continuing to spend very significant amounts of money. There's more than 100 billion rupees in the NHA PSDP this year. But the real emphasis has now shifted to developing our water resources.
Okay.
Pakistan is an agriculture country. Everybody will tell you wherever you go, water is the #1 issue. So for the first time in Pakistan's history, you've got 3 major dams under development right now. So there is Dasu, there is Mohmand, and there is Diamir Basha. So that's one major emphasis change. The second thing is that even within the connectivity or the communication part of it, there is a shift to railways. So ML1, the largest project in history, is going to get funded partly through the PSDP and partly through the CPEC financing. And the third very, very important shift is that we want much greater private sector investment. The government of Pakistan has limited fiscal space, development needs are enormous, so we want to crowd in, as the term is used in economics, private sector investment. So the Public-Private Partnership Authority, which is housed here in the Planning Ministry, and which had not become functional till recently, has now in this year become functional.
And PC1s have been simplified, because we're hearing a lot in the media about the fact that PC1s have been simplified.
So that's the simplification of the process of decision making through which projects are developed. PC1 is the basic project feasibility document on the basis of which the approvals are made. It's not just that, the decision making has been devolved. So you used to have a situation where a very, very small amount could only be approved, less than in the ballpark of about 100 million rupees. Projects could be approved in the ministries. Everything else had to come to the Planning Commission. Now the limit is 2 billion rupees. So projects up to 2 billion rupees can be done in what are called the departmental DWPs, the DDWPs, and only things above that come here. So just to recapitulate, bring in private sector, shift emphasis to water, invest in rail, and simplify processes so that decision making is speeded up.
Okay. So if we come to the CPEC related projects, where does CPEC fit into your government's priorities?
So CPEC is moving into the next phase, as we call it. The first phase was primarily power generation and some highway projects, plus a few projects in govt. That was CPEC Phase 1, infrastructure primarily. Phase 2 is much broader, it's deeper. So industrial cooperation is a very major part of it. 3 different special economic zones coming up. One has already been approved. Another one has just been announced, it has been approved and will be becoming functional in Rashakai in KP. The first one, which was approved last year, was in Faisalabad. And the third one, which is in Dhabeji in Sindh, will also hopefully get done in the next few months. So big emphasis there. Agricultural cooperation now being worked on. Science and technology cooperation being worked on. So it's a much broader relationship. Much more emphasis on the role of the private sector in this phase compared to the government itself.
On CPEC Phase 2, the priorities you've outlined, industrial development, agriculture, socio-economic development, science and technology, MOUs, etc. Is this a focus that your government has, or from day one, was this the direction that CPEC Phase 2 was always going to take?
So there is a fair degree of ambiguity in that because, as you know, initially the MOU was signed, I think, in June 2013. Yeah, it was the first month of the PMLN government. And it wasn't until late in 2015 that we got any visibility into the details. And I became a member of the Parliamentary Oversight Committee, which was set up late in 2015, when there was a lot of uproar from the smaller provinces and the opposition. But the details on the longer term plan were always a bit vague. So therefore, it is difficult to say. But yes, in general, you can say the idea was always that we were going to have a broad relationship which was going to be undertaken in phases.
Okay, so I mean, and I don't know if you have the numbers to hand, but on CPEC Phase 1, which consisted of infrastructure projects, energy projects in particular, how much money has come in? Because we heard a lot about $60 billion worth of projects and so on. So how much of that has actually come to hand?
So the total projects which are under execution right now or have already been completed are about $29 billion. Let's say round off to $30 billion. Okay. So that is what the actual portfolio is. Part of it has come in as equity by the Chinese firms. Largely it is debt which has come in from Chinese financial institutions. And some of it is the contribution of Pakistani private sector, as well as some of it is Pakistani government money, PSDP money, which has gone in. So 4 different sources.
Okay. So under Phase 2, the Chinese ambassador recently mentioned on media that Prime Minister Imran Khan called him up sometime in June and said you wanted Chinese help on agriculture. What is it about agriculture that you need help on from the Chinese?
So if you look at the productivity comparison between Pakistan and Chinese agriculture, you'll see a huge difference. And just like China has made huge strides on industrialization and scientific development, they've also made major strides in the agriculture area. And agriculture is the thing which affects more Pakistanis than any other occupation. It is central to Pakistan's economy right now, even in the 21st century where we stand right now. So the idea is to get Chinese collaboration, and there is already work which is being undertaken, and it's starting to reach a fairly advanced stage in the area of cotton. So Chinese firms collaborating with Pakistani firms to develop seeds which will produce better quality and much higher productivity cotton in the country, and that's just one example.
Okay, and I mean, was your focus on cotton because it was in later stages of research already, or was that because it's Pakistan's largest export earner?
It has the biggest footprint on Pakistan's economy of any of the field crops. Wheat is the biggest crop. It's a staple for diet, or from food security point of view. Wheat is most important. But the overall impact on economy in terms of the job creation downstream of the cotton production, which is the textile industry, the exports which come out of it. So even today, more than half of Pakistan's exports are cotton-related products. So it is very, very critical for Pakistan's economy.
So it was a deliberate policy that you took, that you focused initially on cotton.
It's just simply the biggest opportunity, and therefore the Pakistani private sector and the Chinese private sector has moved earliest in it. As I said, the collaboration that we're looking at, other than some of the scientific institutes and collaborating, most of the work that is now going to be done, both in terms of industrialization as well as agriculture, is going to be private sector to private sector. That's the main theme, and therefore you will not see the government of Pakistan taking on debt for those projects, for development, etc. It's primarily going to be happening through private sector initiative.
So I want to come to industrialization, but just before that, one big thing that Prime Minister Imran Khan touched upon was the fact, and he has several times, he's mentioned how China's lifted over 700 million people out of poverty, and that Pakistan wants to understand the Chinese and how they did this, the Chinese model and how they did this. I mean, what is it particularly you're looking at? How are the Chinese helping you with this?
Okay, so when you look at what can be a relevant development model for Pakistan, the Western world developed at a time where the global conditions were very, very different. They were the early movers. And frankly, they were aided and abetted by the fact that there was colonialism. So they literally shut out all competition to themselves because they'd gone and occupied the rest of the world. And so they got more than a century's head start in it, almost 2 centuries head start in this whole development process. So their experience is not particularly relevant to us. When we look closer to home, we have a large population, we are primarily agrarian, so a lot of similarities with China. Our social structure is also relatively similar. The Eastern culture is different from the Western culture. So that's one of the reasons why we look towards China. The second thing is, like you know, and I think everybody in Pakistan knows by now, central to the Prime Minister's belief system and what drives him in his quest to improve Pakistan is to improve the lives of the common person. And that has been the center of Chinese development strategy also. There are some other countries which have become fabulously wealthy, but they have seen tremendous inequality. And the average per citizen has not benefited as much as we have seen in the case of China.
Right, exactly. Okay, so if we go towards industrialization, which you've mentioned is part of CPEC Phase 2, SEZs, we have 9 CPEC SEZs, but we've only seen so far two of them being inaugurated. Why are we working so slowly on the SEZs? What is our timeline in mind?
Well, first, if you go back, the MOU signed in 2013, there was talk about industrialization even there. 5 years later, when the PMLN government left, there was nothing on the ground. There was not a single SEZ. So this is work which has primarily been done under the current government, and we have now reached a stage where Faisalabad, as I said, was done last year. It started populating, and we've got investment starting to come in, and most importantly, investment coming in from Chinese companies in there also.
Do you have any clue on what kind of numbers we're talking about?
It's the initial stage, so I don't have the exact numbers. The Faisalabad authority guys might have the exact numbers. In fact, I remember him telling me about 3 weeks back how many companies have bought land there. But it's starting to happen, and there is Chinese investment acquisition already starting to take place. In the case of Rashakai, it's even more interesting because the developer is a Chinese firm. So the marketing of Rashakai is the responsibility of this Chinese firm, which has obviously got very well connected within China. So we're hoping to see some very exciting developments there, and Chinese companies starting to come in and take advantage of the Pakistani incentives which have been offered, and put it in the context of the current situation with the foreign policy stance of the Trump administration and the rising conflict that is taking place and playing out even in the economic sphere between China and Pakistan and the US. It's creating opportunities for other countries like Pakistan. So we expect that in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll see significant movement in this area.
Are these CPEC-related SEZs only open to Chinese investors, or are they open to international investors as well?
They're open to anybody who wants to come and invest in Pakistan, even in terms of joint development of projects. In 2018, soon after the government was formed, when the Chinese NDRC chief was visiting Pakistan, who heads the CPEC effort on the Chinese side, remember meeting here. And after that, a joint communique was also issued. And China had said that it welcomes even other countries coming in and working jointly on projects. So within the SOZs, of course, it is open to any investor from around the world. But even on a single project, there can be potential collaboration.
Is there a particular kind of industry that you're trying to welcome into Pakistan from China and other countries?
So it will depend on the endowments that Pakistan has. What does Pakistan has? Pakistan has cheap labor at this point in time. Pakistan has a lot of cotton available. Pakistan has other agri products available. So the Chinese companies which will come in will obviously come in and invest in those industries where they see competitive advantage in Pakistan and where Pakistani economic endowment fits in.
How are you ensuring, though, that Pakistan focuses more on value-added goods rather than it focuses on primary goods, such as, let's say, cotton, for example, or it becomes just a simple transit route for Chinese goods?
So first of all, you follow a natural value-added curve. So you start at the low end and then you graduate upwards. It's very, very difficult for somebody to come in straight at the upper end of the value addition. And even in cotton, I can take cotton and convert it. We used to sell cotton raw. Pakistan used to be a big exporter. Remember, when our total exports were just a few $1 billion, more than $500 million of raw cotton used to get exported. Now we are able to consume all of it, but we sell it mostly in low value-added products. But if you go, and you know this better than me, some of the best Italian and French designer dresses that you buy, you can imagine.
Bias question.
Beg your pardon?
I said, is this a gender bias answer? I would know better than you.
Yeah. Because most members of humanity are better dressed than I am, and would know more about fashion than I do. But certainly. You can have tremendous value addition even within the textile front, and we haven't been able to do that. So yes, we should be moving up the value addition curve, but you move up the value addition curve based on certain fundamentals. So you have to lay those foundations first before you start moving up.
Why did we have to create Cpex SCs then? Because we already had SCs. Why differentiate between the two?
So there are special incentives which have been given under these terms, and as I said, in some of these cases, the developers themselves are Chinese themselves. So that's why the idea was to create the ideal conditions. We had export processing zones earlier, but these SCZs bring something special. Those were only export-oriented. SCZs are not just export-oriented.
So they'll be allowed to sell their goods within the domestic market?
They will also be allowed to sell goods within the domestic market.
But do you have a push? Would you prefer them to be export-related goods, or not particularly? You don't mind where they sell their goods?
Exports are absolutely vital for Pakistan. So Pakistan needs to start exporting to the rest of the world. We need to start developing our export industry because until we do that, right now our growth is limited by our export potential. Because as you have seen in the last 20 years repeatedly, the moment we start some growth in the economy, because our exports are limited, when growth arrives, imports increase, the trade deficit rises, your current account deficit gets to a level which is not sustainable, and back you go into a macroeconomic stabilization program, an IMF, and you have to shrink the economy again. So if you want to get out of this trap, you have to push exports. So exports are vital, but that's not the only thing. There are other things. For example, you're interested in technology transfer, simple things like digital commerce. China has been hugely successful in that. Some of their companies are amongst the world leaders, and that's vital to get economic growth going, and particularly getting grassroots entrepreneurship going. So not just exports, but particular interest is exports.
So one of the things you mentioned is, maybe the slow progress that the last government made on SCZs and some of the other plans that were under the CPEC plan. Is that the reason why CPEC authority was set up? Why was the CPEC authority set up? Because 5-6 years we didn't have an authority, and we apparently didn't need one. But your government came and set it up.
So maybe we didn't need one even at that point in time. What you saw were a few large projects get executed at that point in time. There was no progress at all on industrialization. There was no progress at all on the agriculture side. There was no progress at all on the science and technology side, etc., etc. And as we move into phase 2, as I said, if you're going to be private sector led, there will be many small to medium size and some large size private investments taking place in these SCZs. There will be many different investments taking place in agriculture. So the scope of the work is expanding tremendously. So what we were doing earlier is within the Planning Commission, there was one mid-tier bureaucrat who was full-time responsible for this work, and then he reported into the Secretary Planning, who has all these other responsibilities to take care of also. So it was decided that the phase that we are now moving into, we need to have a more robust management system in place, which can deal with the additional challenges which are going to arise.
How have you divided the responsibilities between the two, between CPEC Authority and the Planning Ministry? Is there a clear distinction?
So the Planning Ministry is responsible for the overall development strategy of the country. CPEC is an important part, but a part of that overall development strategy. So that's the construct. And then in the way the organization is structured, at the highest level is the JCC, as you know, which is chaired on the Chinese side by the NDRC and on the Pakistani side by the planning minister. And that's the connect. And then there are the JWGs below that. So it's connected and it's part of the overall planning system.
How many meetings has the JCC had? I mean,
So
how many?
JCC meets annually. This year we were trying to have actually a special JCC this year because we were trying to accelerate things, and there was an in-principle agreement between Pakistan and China, and tentatively April was the date which was set. And then, as you know, COVID hit and everything stalled. So now we're talking about the next JCC, maybe in October, maybe in November. We are hoping to have the next JCC, which will be in Beijing.
Okay. So the final question that I have for you is more a general question on the kind of information warfare that CPEC and Pakistan's relations with China suffer from. And I'd like to get your thoughts on why do you think there is so much emphasis on spreading disinformation about CPEC, its role, the talk about a debt trap that Pakistan is suffering? Even a few weeks ago, the mention of the fact that President Xi was apparently coming to Pakistan and had cancelled the trip. I mean, Indian media was full of this story, which was then rebutted by the Chinese embassy here. Why do you think CPEC is under this kind of focus? And what is your government doing as a strategy about it?
Okay, so we look at CPEC as an economic relationship which is adding another dimension to already a relationship spanning half a century, which is of a strategic nature, and it embodies several different aspects. But the economic relationship had not reflected the kind of the overall relationship which was there between Pakistan and China. CPEC is filling in that gap, and now economic relationship. And if you look at the appointment of the next Chinese ambassador coming to Pakistan also, that is also a reflection of the increasing importance of the economic ties between Pakistan and China. But how did the rest of the world look at it, and how did India look at it? I still remember I told you this Parliamentary Oversight Committee for CPEC was set up a few years back, and the first presentation I remember was in the PM house at that point in time, and we were shown videos of Indian news, and it was a 2.5 minute segment on CPEC, and the entire segment showed missiles, jet aircrafts, army parades, and it was literally shown as a part of war. There is a global realignment taking place. In many ways, it is fraught with risk. If you look at the history of the world, very rarely has it happened that a new global power has emerged without a clash taking place with the existing power. We are hoping that won't be the case this time, but in the last few years, you've seen how things have become more tense between between China and the US. Pakistan's close relationship with China brings us up into a part of the relationship, and India being used by or being viewed by the Americans as a strategic anchor to their influence in this region complicates the picture even more. So clearly there is an attempt to try and make sure that every hurdle that can be created, at least on the part of the Indians, to the successful development of CPEC. One, it directly affects the Pakistani economy. Anything which is good for Pakistan, good for Pakistan's economy, is generally seen as a negative development by the Indians. But in this particular case, there also is the Indian ambition to dominate this sphere, and China's strength is a counterweight to that. So in this particular case, there are multiple reasons why India has a strong strategic interest in both trying to make sure that CPEC does not succeed, and some of the developments in Balochistan, we believe, are linked to that desire on the part of the Indians, and as well as creating a narrative around the globe against CPEC, which mires it into controversy and trying to create fissures within Pakistani society and trying to raise voices against CPEC. Luckily, that has not happened, and inshallah will not happen.
Asad Umar, thank you so much for your time today.
Welcome.